Hello everyone. In the previous session, I showed a simple demo of a SAP UI5 application where you can do some local CRUD operations and then hit submit changes and send the changes to the backend. In this session, we will look at how you can do the insert and maybe the update part of the application. So for this, I'm going to the next branch, which is branch 3. And this is going to talk about how you can add local entries onto the OData model and then go ahead and submit the changes. But before that, I want to have a quick theory part of it. So the OData model that we are using here is the version V2. V4 behaves a little differently, so I'm not going to talk about it at this moment. But in OData V2, this is how you would do it. So we all know that the OData model is a server-side model. So the server side on the back end, this contains the source of truth, and this has all of the data. Now the OData model itself, it can make a request to the backend and get maybe a subset of the data. So even though this OData model has about 100 entries for a particular entity set, that doesn't necessarily mean that the backend only has 100 entries. Whatever the OData model requests, that's the data that the backend is going to send. So maybe a subset of the data is here in this OData model local to this SAP UI5 application. Now, this OData model is then bound to this table control, this UI control. In this case, this is going to be a table, and all these 100 entries now display on the table based on the settings on the table. So we have the table that is bound to this OData model. Now this binding part of this OData model to this UI control, SAP UI5 has an object for it called the binding object. So this binding object has all the information about the binding between this OData model and this particular UI control. In this case, this is the table. So for this particular binding, this binding object has all of that information. Now, the OData model itself has a couple of methods by which you can add an entry to the OData model. So we will look at the very first method. This is the create method. Now, this create method, let's see what it does. It creates a new entry in the OData model on the application side, and this new entry is also displayed on the UI control on the table right here. And this new entry that gets created is also posted to the backend. So the backend now has the new entry as well. Now, this is not exactly what we want. What we want is to be able to create these entries local to this SAP UI5 application, and only after the user is satisfied with all the changes, then once they hit save, that's when we want to post the changes to the backend. So this create method is not going to work for us because this immediately posts or triggers a post request to the backend with the new entry as the payload. So let's discount this create method for now. Now, there is also another method in the OData model. So like I mentioned before, this is the OData version V2 model that we are talking about. This one has a create entry method. Now, this create entry method, what it does is it creates a new entry on the OData model. And as you can see in this diagram right here, it does not trigger a post to the backend. So this looks promising to us, but there's also another drawback of this. This new entry that gets created in this OData model is not displayed on the UI control. So even though this method creates a new entry in the OData model, this does not display it on the UI control, in this case the table. So again, this is not going to work for us. So both the create and the create entry method on the OData model is not going to work for us because one of them triggers a post request to the backend, the other one does not display it on the UI. So how do we go about doing this? So in this case, the binding object comes to our rescue. So I already mentioned that the binding object has all the information between the binding of the OData model and the UI control, in this case, this table right here. So this binding method has a create method. And as you can see, this creates a new entry in the OData model. So because behind the scenes, it calls create entry method is called, and then create a new entry is created on the OData model. And this create method also displays the entry in the UI control as well. So this is exactly what we want. We want to call the create method on the binding object, and this is going to create an entry in the OData model and also display it on the UI control, but it does not trigger any changes to the backend. Now, once you're all set, like let's say you add like 2 or 3 entries and everything looks good, and at this time, then what you can do is the OData model, we all know, has a submit changes method on it. Now, if there are any changes to the OData model, only if there are any changes to the OData model, those changes are sent to the backend as a post request. If there are no changes, then nothing happens between the backend for optimization. Okay, so let's see how this is how we can put this all together. So I've already jumped to branch 3. So in branch 3 in the table, I've created a couple of buttons right here. Create button, and this triggers the on create local method, and then submit changes. This is handled by the on submit event handler. And then if I go into the controller itself, and let's see how we can do the on create local. So like I mentioned before, we want to call the create method on the binding object. So first of all, I need to get access to this binding object for this specific table and this OData model. So that I can do by calling the table get binding items. So really the binding happens on the items. So this is going to give me the binding object right here. So now once I have the binding object, I just need to call the create method on the binding object, and one of the parameters, so it has multiple parameters, but one of the parameters is the object itself, and I have an object with initial values right here, first name, last name, and email. So let me do a CDS watch right here. So this is going to go ahead and do exactly what we want. It's going to create a new entry here, display it on the UI control. And this line right here, let me go ahead and disable this for now. Basically, this is kind of for UI because we now need to make sure that the cells are enabled for editing, because without this line right here, the cells would still be disabled, so you can't type in there. So if I go back to my application itself, so let me go ahead and refresh the app. So I should have these 2 buttons right here, create local and submit changes. I click create local, and you see that the new row is entered with the default values of empty string, but it's disabled, like I can't type in right here. So let's enable those cells. So the way I enable this cell is I have 3 rows right here, 1, 2, 3. Now these 3 rows, they are 2 of them come from the database, from the backend itself. So these are not the new rows that I added, but this new row that I added has a property called transient. Actually, the binding object has there's the binding context has a method called is transient, and if it is true, that means it's a newly created row that is only available on the OData model. So we check if it is a transient row, and if it is a transient row, then we enable the UI control. So that's basically what we do here: enable cells for editing. And here I check if it is transient, and if it is transient, then I set the editable to be true. And also what we need to do is once we hit submit changes, then we want to disable editing for all of these rows. So now let me go ahead and refresh and see what happens now that we have the UI part ready as well. Now when I create local, so the new row is editable. So here I can say Todd. And again, I can add any number of rows right here. Yeah, now that I've added any number of rows, I can create a submit. And in submit changes, all I do is I call submit changes on the main model. And also the other thing I do is I set all the cells for editable as false, because I don't want to be able to edit after this. So let me go ahead and put a breakpoint here. So if I go into the submit changes, I'm going to put a breakpoint here. I'm going to hit submit changes. It's going to trigger once I call submit changes, it's going to trigger a post request to the backend. But in the meantime, I just want to see how my main model looks like. So if I look into my main model, let me say has pending changes, and it should have pending changes because we added 2 new rows, so it is coming as true. And if I go into this main model, and if I look at the main model itself, and if I go into the OData property right here, so where is OData right here, you see that there are 4 rows, and these 2 rows have like a crazy ID, primary key, because this is created locally on the SAPUI5 application. It has still not been resolved yet, but you can see that it has these 4 rows. These 2 rows come from the database. These 2 are the transient rows that I was talking about. Now let me go ahead and let it run through. If I let it run through, it's going to call the batch request. It's going to make 2 post requests within the batch, and now we have all these 4. And then the submit changes also disables editing anymore. So now we have 4 rows, and that's how the create works. So the update is fairly straightforward as well. I will quickly go through the update as well. So if I go here and set it up for update, I'll go to the next branch. So as far as update is concerned, it is fairly simple. So if I go into this update here, as far as update is concerned, all you have to do is make sure that the binding is 2-way binding. In fact, we already set it up for 2-way binding even for the create, because whatever values we changed here needed to be updated onto the OData model. So it was always 2-way binding. By default, the OData model is not 2-way binding, so you would have to change it in the manifest.json file to make sure that it is 2-way binding. So if I go into my manifest.json file, you can see that the default binding mode, I have set it to be 2-way, and we are also using batch request, so that's why all the requests are sent as a single batch operation. So now that we have it set to 2-way, that's all we need to do as far as the update is concerned. So in the update, what I do is if I go to this master view.xml, I've created this new button here to do update. And in my master controller, the only thing that I'm doing in my master controller is I'm going to enable the cells for editing, so that you can keep changing values right there. So if I go into my application itself, if I refresh my application, what I can do is I can hit update. So all the cells become updatable right now. So all the cells are updatable. So I can go ahead and change some of the cells, and then I can hit submit changes. So let me go ahead and remove anything in the network. Submit changes, it's going to send the batch request, and you can see there's a merge, there's another merge right here, and that's how the update works. Okay, so in the next session, I will show you how you can do the delete, and also how you can do the reset as well.